So welcome again, everybody. I'm glad to see you. Hope you had a good week, a healthy week, a productive week. Before beginning, I want to acknowledge the sponsorship of tonight's Shiur. Thank you very much to Anita Schmidig-Lichtblau and Mark Lichtblau, who are sponsoring the Shiur this evening in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Anita's dad, George Schmidig, Zichrono Livracha. Anita, may his neshama have an aliyah. May you, Mark, and the whole family be blessed with long life and good health. So tonight's Parsha is Parshat Vayera. And just to sort of introduce it, just to remind everybody where we left off at the end of Parshat Lech Lecha. Parshat Lech Lecha ends with telling us that Hashem turns to Avram Avinu, who by this point in his life was, I guess we would call a senior citizen. Certainly he's not a young man, late 90s, 99, and gives them a commandment to perform a bris milah, to circumcise himself, and of course all the other male members of his household, which he does, and that's called a brit. Of course, it's called brit milah, but more than just being a definition of the actual procedure called brit milah, it's a covenant, which in some ways, of course, created for Avram, according to some Meforshim, an existential crisis. Abraham's life up until this point had been a life, I guess, best characterized as trying to be a life of kiruv, bringing others to recognize the truth that he worked so hard to understand on his own. And any efforts that Avram could do that would bring people into his tent, he saw as positive. But the corollary is also true. Any efforts that he felt that would move people away from him, that would bring some sort of isolation or distance, he felt to be a negative. And according to some Meforshim, the notion of undergoing a brit milah was exactly that. It wasn't a beloved sign of God's chosenness of him. You would think that that may be something that would be dear to Avram. On the contrary, it created a sense of fear. And according to one Perush, that's one of the reasons that he fell. Vayipol al panav, we read last week, because he felt that this was going to have such a negative impact on him, he wasn't certain what to do. And one midrash also indicates that he had to ask advice from his three closest companions, not part of his family, therefore part of the Canaanite people who he had developed close relationships with. And he actually explored with them the possibility of refusing to do the brit. Imagine turning God down, refusing to do the brit because he was so concerned that the impact would be so devastating that his life's work would be completely undermined. Of course, the one person who agreed with him, Mamre, encouraged Abraham to rely on the God who had saved him and who had guided him all this way. And that's why at the beginning of Parshat Vayera, the pasuk begins, Vayera elav Hashem ve'elonei Mamre. Hashem appeared to him in the plains of Mamre. Now, this is the part of the country that was owned by his companion Mamre. And some of the Meforshim say there are certain details in the Torah that we understand that were necessary for us to learn lessons from the story. But would it not have been enough for the Torah to say, Vayera alav Hashem, v'hu yoshev petach ha'ohel, that Abraham is sitting at the opening of his tent and Hashem appears to him? Does it have to tell us that he's specifically sitting right here at the corner of wherever he's sitting? What's the significance? So the answer is to give credit, everlasting credit, to Mamre. To give him this notion of you were the one who gave him the right advice to continue trusting God and to continue with the brit milah. It does also, I think, suggest an interesting idea that here we have Avram Avinu, whose advice that directed his life was coming from, well, let's say at this point, an Oved Avodah Zarah, an idolater. And I wonder, and I know I'm extrapolating here, but I wonder whether or not one of the perhaps hidden messages of this detail is the idea that sometimes we Jews see ourselves as being so isolated, so victimized, that there's nobody not Jewish who could possibly understand where we're at. There's no one who can offer us insightful advice because we need to sort of circle the wagons around and we need to hunker down and nobody can help us. And yet the Parsha begins by telling us of a time in a country populated by idolaters who clearly were not on the same page as Avraham Avinu, whose worldview was so totally different, some of whom threatened Abraham, yet were able to give him advice about his own faith in God that Avraham couldn't see. I think it's an interesting idea. It's an interesting window and possibility. So let's go back to Pasuk 1, and this time take a look at it from a different angle. Vayera elav Hashem Elonei Mamri v'hu yoshev petach ha'oel kufomim. I'm going to read it again in English. And this time as I read it, think about what's written, but think about what you expect to be written, but isn't. Hashem appeared to him in the plains of Mamre while he was sitting in the entrance of the tent in the heat of the day. Hashem appeared to him. Well, if the verse tells us that Hashem appeared to him, what would be most expected is the next verse. So what does the next verse say? Vayisayina vayar v'hinei shelosha nashim nitzavim alav vayar vayaratz likratam mipetach ha'ohel vayishtachu artza. Stone translation, interpretation. And behold, 3 men were standing over him. He perceived, so he ran toward them from the entrance of the tent and bowed toward the ground. That's nice. But what's not here is what should have been here. Hashem appears to him. So the next thing should have been some conversation, some sign, some prophecy, some form of communication directly from Hashem to Avram. In its place, the Torah tells us about 3 people who are approaching. Why is that? So there are various answers offered. Some suggest, no, Hashem did appear to him. It's true. But how did he appear to him? He appeared to him in the guise of these 3 men. So in fact, there is consistency. Hashem appeared to him. It doesn't necessarily say that. We're obviously interpreting. We're adding that understanding. The plain meaning of the verses seems to somehow exclude Hashem's direct presence. And we understand perhaps that these 3 men, as the story unfolds, it's clear that they're not men, they're malachim. Supporting this interpretation is that no, Hashem really does appear to him, but it's in the guise of angels who to Avram seem to appear as 3 people. Now, Rashi, however, chooses to offer a completely different approach to this. Listen to this Rashi. So Rashi says, Vayera elav, Hashem appeared to him. And these are Rashi's 3 words, and of course he's quoting an earlier text. He's quoting the Gemara, he's quoting the Midrash. This appears in multiple places. And Rashi says, Levaker et hacholeh. Hashem appears to Abraham for the purpose of visiting the sick. Levaker et hacholeh. Why is Abraham sick? Well, he's recovering. He's recuperating from the Brit Milah. And so he falls into the category of being someone who's sick. And so the Parsha begins, Vayera elav, Hashem appears to him for the purpose of visiting the sick. But what's missing? Well, what's going on at this visit? There doesn't seem to be anything happening in the visit. And maybe that's exactly the point. It leads us to the notion that Hashem, in some ways, of course, is now doing the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim, which the Gemara tells us is in fact one of the lessons learned from this pasuk, that just as Hashem fulfills the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim, we emulate Hashem in so many different ways, and this is one of the ways in which we should emulate Hashem. Now, I mentioned before that what Avraham underwent was a Brit Milah, and the word Brit is a covenant. And in the classic understanding of a covenant is some sort of agreement between 2 parties. So Abraham, we clearly see the part that he played in this covenant, and that was the Brit Milah that he underwent for himself and for the other male members of his family. But what about Hashem? So according to this idea, Hashem also shows up. He shows up to be Levaker et hacholeh. He's coming. Not for the purpose of a prophecy, not for the purpose of any instruction, not to teach him a mitzvah, but if Avram took his part seriously and did what he did, Hashem also has to take his part seriously, which is what? To show up. There's a fascinating sforno on this pasuk. I'm assuming that many of us have had the opportunity, the bracha, to attend a Brit Milah, whether it's at shul or somebody's house. If you've been at a shul, then you may have noticed that many shuls, the one that I belong to, as you know, is Sharei Shamayim, we have this beautiful, beautiful chair that was specifically created for Brit Milah. And these chairs are called the Kisei Shel Eliyahu. And that Kisei Shel Eliyahu refers to, as it were, the chair, the spot that is designated for Eliyahu HaNavi, who, for a variety of historical reasons, our tradition says, as it were, comes to every Brit Milah. And whether you have a beautifully manufactured or created chair like we have or other shuls, it is really irrelevant. There's always a chair that we designate as the chair for Kisei Shel Eliyahu. Seforno invokes this idea of the Kisei Shel Eliyahu, and he says something fascinating at the very end of his explanation to this pasuk. Seforno says that this concept of God visiting Avraham as part of God's fulfillment of his part of the Brit, that idea underlies the practice that we now have of having a Kisei Shel Eliyahu, which is this chair, as I said, designated for Eliyahu Navi. Seforno suggests that it is in fact the Kisei, not of Eliyahu, but he calls it the Kisei Shel HaShechina, the Kisei of the divine presence. So God, Hashem, must be present, so to speak, at every circumcision, as through this ritual, he enters into a personal covenant and relationship with every newborn male child. So just like Hashem came to Avraham for no other reason, but just to be with him, to sit with him, to, as it were, make his presence known to Avraham, so too does Hashem turn up at every Brit Milah. And Seforno suggests perhaps that's the reason that we have this chair. We designated Kisei Shel Eliyahu, but in its original sort of conceptualization, says Seforno, it's there to, as it were, welcome Hashem's presence. But if we're already talking about the idea of Bikur Cholim, let me just veer off a little bit into a slightly more halachic discussion. And I mentioned before that what we do in our lives, in many areas of our lives, is we try to emulate the paths that Hashem follows, as it were. And the Rambam, in the 14th chapter of Hilchot Avel, chapter Yudalit, he writes that certain mitzvot that we do, like visiting the sick or comforting the mourner, nichum avelim, or the halvayat hamet, escorting a dead body to burial, and some of the other things that we're familiar with, they're all included under the general mitzvah that we would call ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, that quintessential mitzvah of performing acts of loving kindness for other people. So anytime a person would seem to do a favor, do an act of kindness to somebody else, he in fact is fulfilling the commandment of ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. But the Rambam adds, our Chachamim added a formal obligation to visit the sick, levaker et hacholeh, as well as lenachem et ha'avel, to comfort the bereaved, and even to celebrate with a chatan and kala. So while you could say these two things fall under the category of general category of haftar et hakamocha, bikur cholim, visiting the sick, is a specially designated and identified mitzvah. So how do you do that? Like, what does it involve? Does it involve anything? So Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked this question a long, long time ago. Rav Moshe Feinstein, the great posek for North America, he died in the year 1986. So in his collected shuvot, his collected responsa, he tries to sort of dissect what the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim actually entails. And he says some very interesting things. He was asked whether somebody can fulfill the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim by telephone. Can you call a person? Can you make a cell phone call? You live too far, or you're not going to make it before the person goes to bed. You had a late night meeting. You love to show up, but you can't. So at least you call. Is that considered Bikur Cholim? You're having a conversation. There's some sort of, mention or FaceTiming, Zooming. So I may not be with that person in their room, but we're having, as it were, perhaps a face-to-face. Now, Rav Moshe did not address this as a FaceTime or Zoom question. Obviously, historically, that wouldn't have been made any sense. But he does suggest the following, that the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim actually can be divided into three separate parts. Part number one is that when you go to visit somebody who is not well and you're in that person's presence and you spend time with them, something inside of you gets stirred. And hopefully it gets stirred enough to the point that you're actually going to daven for that person. So visiting the sick is important, being in their actual presence in order to arouse you to daven on their behalf to Hashem. The second thing that Bikur Cholim ought to accomplish is that by going to visit the Choleh where they live, wherever it is, gives you the opportunity to give them practical support and assistance. So it could be they can't clean their house, so you can help them. Or they can't organize things around their bed, so you help them. Or maybe they need some task done that they can't do, so you do. Take out the laundry, take out the garbage, do some errands, clean the house, do the laundry, whatever it is. So those things, says Rav Moshe, also are part of Bikur Cholim. And the third thing he says is that by the virtue of the fact that you're there, you lift the spirits of the Choleh. And if anybody's ever had the opportunity, I'm sure many of you, all of you, have to go visit somebody who's sick, very often they say, I really appreciate your visit. Thank you. And it doesn't have to be an hour visit. And while Rav Moshe didn't have this, I'm having this. Part of doing this mitzvah is using your seichel. Going for a visit to somebody who's sick is a mitzvah. But that could maybe that's just 20 minutes because they may need to rest. You may have brought them a little bit of relief and uplifted their spirits, but they still need to recover and they still need to rest. And sometimes they feel a little uncomfortable because they may have to use the bathroom and they don't want to do that while you're sitting there with them. So they're thinking, I hope they leave soon because I need to go to the bathroom, and they don't want to go. So it's always helpful to keep in mind that you're not there for the purpose of making yourself feel good. You're there for the purpose of making the Choleh feel better. And so sometimes a short visit is exactly what's needed. So Rav Moshe goes on to say that if the only way you can actually connect with the Choleh is by phone, you can certainly fulfill the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim with the first and the third. You can be aroused to daven on their behalf. You can lift their spirits, but the practical one of actually helping them physically can't be done. So according to Rav Moshe, the second part of the mitzvah counts as Bikur Cholim. Some of you may be familiar with the name of Asher Weiss, who is a leading posek in Israel. He's the posek for the Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, so he deals with a lot of cutting-edge questions, certainly within the medical community, but even before that, he was recognized, certainly within Israel and world over, as a leading arbiter of halacha. He takes issue with Rav Moshe, and he doesn't believe Rav Moshe's analysis is correct. And he takes it on very simply. He says, visiting the sick is just what it says. Visiting the sick. Being in the physical, personal presence of the Choleh. Everything else is amazing. It's Gemilut Chasadim, it's Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha. But if you make a phone call, nobody's discouraging you from making a phone call. If the only thing you can do is FaceTime. If the only thing is Zoom. But understand that while that is going to be under the category of Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha, it's not, says Rav Asher Weiss, it is not considered to be fulfillment of the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. So going back to our pasuk, Torah tells us, Vayera lav Hashem. Hashem appears to Avram for what purpose? To be mevaker choleh, to, as it were, fulfill the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. Certainly Hashem doesn't have a physical presence, but it's clear that Avraham sensed the divine presence, and that therefore is the way in which we ought to be fulfilling the mitzvah to the extent that we can. So I want to go on in Perek Yud-Chet, we're in chapter 18. You don't have to follow the Chumash if you don't want to, but certainly you're more than welcome to. And I'm going to now turn to Pasuk Tet Zayin, Pasuk 16. So amongst the things that the angels did while they came to Abraham was to visit with him, but they also came to share some news. They shared good news that come a year, Sarah would be a mother, she would give birth. But they also came for the purposes which was not so filled with blessing, and ultimately was the destruction of the city of Sdom and the entire area around Sdom, which was made up of five communities. So reading now from Pasuk Tet Zayin in Perek Yudchet, Vayakumu misham ha'anashim vayashkifu al pnei Sodom, ve'Avraham holech imam lishalcham. And so the men, of course, we know that they're not human beings, they really are angels. So the men got up from there and gazed down towards Sodom, while Avraham walked with them to escort them. And just as a side note, the last part of the pasuk, he escorted them. That's actually also a mitzvah, the idea of escorting a guest out of the house. So when somebody comes, even today, to visit you, it's considered appropriate for the host not just to say goodbye from your living room and let the guests leave the house and the porch, but you walk them. You walk them to the door, you walk them down the stairs, a little bit on the walkway, and from there they take their leave. That is the appropriate way. And this is what Avraham is teaching us right here. These guests came to his house, so he now is escorting them as they leave his presence. But the Torah tells us that while they're leaving, there's an act here of looking down. And the verb that the Torah uses is vayashkifu al pnei Sodom. So one possible explanation, and some of the commentaries suggest this, is that this is actually simply a description of geographical differences. That where Avraham was in Alonei Mamre was on an elevation that was higher than Sdom. Sdom, of course, is closer to the Dead Sea. So we know Dead Sea is the lowest place on planet Earth. So Avraham was living in a higher location. So it made sense that they're looking down, they're gazing down from the higher location. But that's not everybody's interpretation of why this word was chosen. And it's certainly not Rashi's interpretation. One of the things that classic rabbinic interpretation of the Torah and Tanakh used is to try to derive meaning from words that appear in multiple places in Chumash. And sometimes meaning is derived from one place and then transferred to the place over here. So this word vayashkifu, while not so common, gazing down, there are other words having to do with sight, lirot, certainly lihistakel, labit, but vayashkifu does appear elsewhere in Tanakh. And Rashi, as a master of Tanakh, is quite aware of that. And he tells us a principle. He tells us a rule about the use of this word, its essential meaning. And I'm going to read this Rashi to you. Kol hashkafa shebimikra, anytime this verb of gazing down is used in Tanakh, says Rashi, lira'ah, it's always brought or in the context of something bad about to happen. Gazing down or gazing at something prior to a very, very undesirable or negative outcome. The only time, says Rashi, that there's an exception to this rule that hashkafa or hashkifa always is used lira'ah happens in Sefer Devarim, Parashat Kitavo, when a person brings his first fruits, the bikurim, to the Beit HaMikdash. There, the word hashkifa is also written. But in that context, says Rashi, it's used in a positive context. I'm not going to read all of Rashi, but I'm just doing paraphrasing, which is sufficient for the part where I'm sharing with you right now. So this hashkifa is not just telling us geographical, they're higher, Sodom is lower. It's telling us they're looking down, and the use of the word is as it were a foreshadowing of some very terrible outcome, which we as the readers, of course, completely understand. So let's just take a look, think for a second right now. Rashi is telling us that the word hashkifa is always used lira'ah, except for one case. Except for one case, and that's coming, it's not even in our Sefer, it's not even near Parshat Vayera, but it does appear in Sefer Devarim. Rav Chaim Hershenson, whose name I was not familiar with until I started preparing for this Shiur, from what I can see, lived in Romania, and he wrote a book of commentary on Rashi. Now, Rashi is there's about 200 commentaries at least on Rashi, because while Rashi may seem to be simplistic, it's so far from the truth. What Rashi writes and doesn't write, and how he edited the things that he edited, is a sign of pure mastery and brilliance. So Rav Chaim Hershenson, writing in his book called Nimukei Yosef, asks, I think, an interesting question around the Rashi that I just paraphrased for you. And he asks, why does Rashi find it necessary to let us know that there's one exception to the rule, that every time the Torah uses the word hashkifa, or a form derivative thereof, it has to do with a negative outcome? Why does he bring the case in Sefer Dvarim of the farmer bringing his fruit and asking God to look down from the heavens, hashkifa, and bless us, bless me, bless my family, because I fulfilled your mitzvah. I've done all the things that you've asked me to do. I've taken the tithes, the masrot, I've given them out to the poor people. I've given everything I should have given. And here I am at the Beit Mikdash fulfilling my latest or my last requirements. So please look down and bless me. Why do you and I, reading Parshat Vayera, need to know that? It would be important when we get to Parshat Ki Tavo and Sefer Dvarim. But Rabbi Hershenson in his book wonders, why is Rashi, or why does he feel compelled, as it were, to make sure that while we're reading the story of the impending destruction of Sodom, why should we know that there is an exception to the word hashkifa that comes in Sefer Dvarim, where there it actually has a positive connotation, unlike all the other places, or this place specifically, which is negative? So maybe we can answer, Rav Hershenson tries to answer it this way, that Rashi deliberately included this comment here because it actually bears relevance to the understanding of the story as it's unfolding and it's being retold. So remember that according to Rashi, the farmer in Parshat Ki Tavo and Sefer Dvarim is asking God with this term, hashkifa, which normally refers to something angering or some form of punishment, because after having distributed all the tzedakah money that he was supposed to the needy, he has the power to transform God's punishment. He has the power. You do the mitzvot you're supposed to do, you can transform what could have been a negative outcome. Not only negative, a painful, punitive outcome. You can transform it. How? By fulfilling these mitzvot that Hashem bestows upon you. You could have escaped all, we did. That farmer does escape the punishment by doing that which Hashem asked him to do, by showing compassion, by making sure the tithes to the poor were properly distributed. So, by mentioning this explanation here, Rashi may be alluding to this idea that although Sodom is now at the precipice of destruction, we know the story, it didn't have to end that way. It didn't have to end that way. Rather, the people of Sodom could have escaped their punishment had they chosen to show sensitivity to the poor and the underprivileged. The people of Sodom were extremely notorious for their selfish behavior, not wanting to part with their money, not wanting to help anybody in the community, even guests, as we know from the story, as the angels appear to Lot in Sodom. And so had they acted with a little bit more compassion and generosity, they could have, as it were, changed the outcome of the story. They could have transformed it. They could have transformed the divine anger, which is described by the word hashkifa, but they could have transformed it into mercy. And he ends, Rabbi Hershenson ends his comment with a really interesting bit of social commentary. And he says that in the early 20th century, America, the Golden Medina, was a very prosperous place for American Jewry. And he claims that Hashem blessed America with peace and this prosperity during that period of time, even though that period of time in the United States, in America, was one of tremendous neglect of Torah and mitzvot, and especially Shabbat. So how was God's negative response to the widespread abandonment of Shabbat and so many other parts of Torah and mitzvot? Why was it subverted? How was it subverted? Because of the extensive generosity and involvement of the Jewish community in charitable causes. And so Rabbi Hershenson says, by showing sensitivity to those in need, he maintains, this is his claim, the Jews in the United States at that time managed to escape what otherwise could have been a period not of blessing, but of negative consequences, maybe even divine punishment. I found that to be a very interesting sort of comment. And as many have said, and even Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, called on the United States the Medina of Chesed. And it was, and not only towards Jews, but even, of course, in its social policies and its safety nets and all the things and all the legislation and all the institutions that the United States built that really were support to so many people in need. So still staying in this parak, and I want to go a little bit further in parak Yud Chet. Hashem has an interesting conversation with, or he presents us with an interesting insight. Hashem Amar, Hashem says, as it were, to himself, Avraham. Hashem says, shall I conceal from Avraham what I'm planning to do? Asher ani oseh. The Avraham hayo yihiyeh legoy gadol atzum v'nivruchu vo kol goyei haaretz. How can I not tell Avraham my plan about destroying stone and the upheaval I'm going to bring to the entire area of Eretz Canaan? Avraham will in one day become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by him. Ki yedativ leman asher yitzaveh et banav et beito acharav v'shamru derech Hashem la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat leman havi Hashem al Avraham et asher diber alav. Reading the translation, for I have loved him because he, referring to Avraham, commands his children and his household after him that they keep the way of Hashem, doing charity and justice, la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat, in order that Hashem might then bring upon Abraham that which he had spoken of him. So what I want to take a look at with you is those two terms. Hashem describes Abraham as instructing his children, bequeathing to his children, to his descendants, us, this notion, a commitment to do tzedakah u'mishpat. What do those two words mean? Tzedakah u'mishpat. And is the order significant? Does tzedakah precede mishpat? Should mishpat precede tzedakah? So let's just think about the words. Most times we talk about tzedakah as referring to charity, giving people in need the support that they need, whether it be actual money or whatever other form of support. And the word mishpat is usually considered to be justice. So tzedakah is a word that invokes kindness, support, whereas mishpat invokes justice. And Avraham, of course, seems to be committed to both and committed to teaching his children both. So if tzedakah refers to this charitable donations, acts of kindness, and mishpat denotes, I guess, observance of law itself and acting justly, which one of these two words should come first? Should mishpat come before tzedakah? Doesn't adherence to the law come first and then kindness after that? Shouldn't there be at least adherence to the standards of law, and then kindness would be sort of like going beyond that? Yet, of course, the Torah seems to be reversing the order and saying tzedakah precedes mishpat. So I want to suggest to you an explanation that emerged from a letter from one of the Torah scholars in 1935. And his name is Rabbi Isser Zalman Meltzer. And he wrote a letter. Actually, it was a letter of congratulations to what is now a charity organization, very active, still is, called Ezra's Torah. It's a charity foundation that provides money to families, especially Torah families who are struggling, but not exclusively. And he wrote this letter in which he explains this part of the verse. He explains the two words and the order of these two words. And he says this, that tzedakah was placed before mishpat to teach this idea, that very often charitable donations have the status of mishpat rather than tzedakah. That if we think of tzedakah as something that would come after mishpat, Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer says it sometimes is that it's a different understanding. Sometimes tzedakah is in fact mishpat. Why? When you see somebody in dire straits who really is in desperate need of support and assistance, so helping them is in the category of mishpat. That's justice. That's the standard call to duty. That's not tzedakah. There's nothing exceptional about that. Somebody needs your help, then that's the right thing to do. That's the tzedek thing to do. That's the righteous thing to do. It's not tzedakah in the sense that, that's going above and beyond. No, says Rabbi Isser Zalman Meltzer, that's not going above and beyond. That's exactly what the law says you have to do. So according to Rabbi Zalman Isser Meltzer, according to Pirkei Avot, interesting, toward the end of Pirkei Avot, I believe it's in the 5th chapter, the Mishnah says there are 4 sort of types of people in the world, and they're characterized by different attitudes. So a person who is an evil person is characterized by this attitude. Shali, shali, v'shocha shali. What's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine. That's evil. That's totally evil. What would a chassid, in this case a pious person, what attitude best describes a pious person? A pious person is shali shocha, v'shocha shocha. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is yours. That's a level of piety that most of us, I think, do not get to. But there is a level which is considered to be, according to one opinion in the Mishnah, parav. It's in the middle. What would that be? Shali, shali, v'shocha, shocha. What's mine is mine, and what's yours is yours. Sounds parav. In fact, you could say it's actually very respectful. I'm not encroaching on you. Shocha, shocha. I'm willing to honor the sort of space that you have, and you will honor the space that I have. But interestingly enough, after that opinion in the Mishnah is called Beinoni, this is a midah Beinoni. This seems to be average. It's not particularly pious. It certainly isn't evil. It's not a rasha. It's middle of the road. But the Mishnah then says, Yesh Omrim. There are, however, those who say that shali shali v'shocha shocha, what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours, is actually midat stom. This is a attitude that is best characterized as the quality of stom. So far from being average, middle of the road, parav, this particular view would suggest that this is terrible, unbelievably unacceptable. This is what animated stom. Well, what is that? Like, why? What's so terrible about shali shali v'shocha shocha? So it seems that the people, the authors of the Mishnah that would say that, believe that a shali shali v'shocha shocha, what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours attitude essentially means I don't want to get involved. Whatever you need, that's your problem. You solve it. That's shocha shocha. I'm keeping my nose out of this. I'm going to give you the space. I'm going to respect your property. I'm going to respect the privacy of your life. Don't call on me because I'm not there for you, and I don't expect you to be there for me. But if that's how we build our society, if that's the basis in which we create any sort of social contract, shali shali v'shocha shocha, that's the sort of social contract that concludes with stone. And interestingly enough, a very interesting chap on this. Shali shali shocha shocha, the Mishnah says, zo midah beinoni. That's average. And then it goes on to say this next part, yesh omrim, there are those who say, shali shali shocha shocha, zo midat stone. Yesh omrim would literally mean there are those who say, simply saying that the Mishnah is adding another opinion. However, maybe there's something a little deeper about the addition of those two words, yesh omrim. There are those who say, when a single individual leads his or her life animated by the idea of shali shali shocha shocha, it certainly isn't great, but mostly they're going to hurt only themselves. But when there's a situation described as yesh omrim in the plural, when this becomes the guiding rule of a community, a plurality of people, yesh omrim, then really there's a danger. When one person in a community seeks to sort of lead an insulated life, an isolated life, wishing not to reach out or to be approached, not great, but it certainly doesn't dissolve the fabric of a community. But when it's yesh omrim, then it becomes a serious threat to social cohesion and the strength of the community. So going back to Rabbi Isser Zalman Meltzer, who mentioned this Mishnah, and he suggests, of course, that this Mishnah in Pirkei Avot shows us that this idea of shali shali v'shocha shocha, what's mine and mine, what's yours is yours, this in fact is unacceptable, because mishpat, justice, which was sorely lacking in Sdom, cannot thrive when you have this attitude. The minimum expectation is that you step up and to do the right thing, not because it's tzedakah, not because it's above and beyond. That is mishpat. That is the fabric of social society. That is the expectation. Shali, shali, shocha, shocha can never be the way in which we build a society. That's a society of isolationism. That's a society of I take care of my needs and you figure it out for yourself. Therefore, says Rabbi Isser Zalman Meltzer, that's why it began first with tzedakah u mishpat, because sometimes tzedakah is mishpat. Okay, moving on. We know the famous gutsy move of Avram Avinu. When told about the destruction of Sdom, Avram Avinu begins to engage in a very bold, as it were, debate with God, challenging God. Pasuk Chafei 25, chapter Perek Yud 25. Chalila lecha me'asot kadavar hazeh lahamid tzadik im rasha v'haya kat tzadik ka rasha. How can you do this, God? Translation in the stone. It would be sacrilege to you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the righteous along with the wicked. Kat tzadik ka rasha, so the righteous will be like the wicked. It would be sacrilege to you. Chalila lecha hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. Shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? Ktav Sofer, the son of the Chassam Sofer, the great holy teacher of Torah from Pressburg, whose insights are extraordinary both on the Gemara as well as on the Torah, his son, Ktav Sofer, in his commentary to the Torah, has an interesting comment that I wanted to share with everybody tonight. Did Avram really think God was not going to do justice? Did he really think, did Avram actually believe that God is unable to discern who was righteous, who was wicked? Did Avram have a moment where he thought that God was not going to abide by the rules of fairness and justice? So how could he do that? And looking at the actual words that Avram utters, kat tzadik karasha, not clear. What is that ka, that kaf? Like the righteous, so too the wicked? What does that mean? So it offers a really interesting, I think, idea in terms of who was righteous and who was wicked. And Avraham, according to the Ketav Sofer, is worried about the following scenario: that there are totally righteous people and that there are totally evil people who can be identified, so is clear. But there's another category. There's a category that's not black and it's not white. It's way more murky. It's way more gray. And that category, I'll just read this part from the Ketav Sofer. Avo yesh mi shehu tzadik neged doro. There is at times a person who is perceived by his generation, by his community, to be righteous. V'nechshav latzadik be'einehem, v'lifnei Hashem hu rasha. He may be deemed and judged to be a righteous person by the standards of that community, but in God's absolute standards, this man is wicked. He's a rasha. Everybody thinks that this guy is amazing. Oh my goodness. But in God's eyes, this person is not. He's a rasha, clearly. Ubedin she'anesh. And according to every sort of divine justice and fairness, this man should be punished, or woman should be punished. V'al elu yitpalel Avraham shelo yitchalel shem shamayim. And it's about these people that Avraham was praying that there not be a, God forbid, profanation of God's name. There should not be a chilul Hashem with this category of people. Meaning, ki be'enei ha'am nechshav latzadik neged harashaim gemurim b'faresya. This person seems to be righteous compared to the obviously public wicked people that everybody knows are wicked. But these people, compared to them, are deemed to be in a way higher category. The Zehu She'amar, and this is what Avraham was referring to when he turns to God in that bold, brazen move and says, Chalila lecha, God forbid, it's sacrilege, lahamit tzadikim rasha, for you to kill the tzaddik im rasha, meaning, hainu mi shehu tzaddik im rasha, for you to kill the people that this community thinks are righteous with the people that you know are wicked, that's going to result in a chilul Hashem. And so therefore, Avraham says, if you do that, then everybody will declare there is no such thing as divine justice. God makes no distinctions. You see, this God of Abraham, this God who claims to be the God of the world, is incapable of being fair. Look who he killed. The people who are Rasha, okay, we're going to figure that out. We got that. But the people who we called Tzaddikim, So Avraham is worried. And that's why he uses that phrase, that odd use of language, Kat Tzaddik Karasha, because everybody's going to say, this tzaddik should not have been put to death. But you, God, know that this tzaddik really is more like the Rasha in your eyes. But in their eyes, he may be the tzaddik. It's an interesting idea because I think it calls into question, certainly, some notion of moral relativism. How do we know? What is the determination that makes people tzaddikim or rishaim? What are the guidelines? What are our criteria? Are they changing? Can society declare some people in one era to be tzaddikim, but in another era not to be tzaddikim? That's what Avraham seems to be implying, that at the time he lived, there might have been a category of people who seemed to be on a higher moral level, but in an absolute sense, of course, they were not. And when God judges them in the same manner exactly, then that becomes a problem. Interesting. Okay, I'm going to move now a little bit later in the Parsha. Now we're going to turn to Perek Chaf, another story. This Parsha is so filled. So the Torah tells us that Avraham continued his sojourning, and he ended up in a part of the country called Gerar. Gerar was ruled by a king whose name is Avimelech. And Avraham and Sarah and their entourage arrive in Gerar. And Sarah, being a strikingly beautiful woman, was taken by the king of Gerar for himself. God appears to Avimelech and he says that you have taken someone's wife. Now, Avimelech did nothing. He did not violate, thank God, Sarah. But Hashem turns to him and says that you must not do anything. You must, however, return this woman back to her husband. I will kill you, says Hashem to Avimelech. I will put you to death. And not only that, the Torah tells us a couple of psukim later that Hashem afflicted the entire community as a result of what happened, to the point that no woman gave birth. They all became barren until Avram, in fact, prayed on their behalf. So Hashem turns to Avimelech and says, "V'ata," and now Hashev eshet ha'ish ki navihu, v'yitpalel ba'adcha v'echyeh, v'im eincha meshiv da timot tamut ata v'chol asher lach. But now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not return her, be aware that you shall surely die, you and all that is yours." So the Gemara in Masechet Bava Kama 92 tries to understand what is it that Hashem was trying to tell Avimelech by describing Abraham as a prophet, ki navihu. Okay. What is it about that that made it appropriate for him to return Sarah? Wouldn't it have been the right thing to do whether or not Abraham was designated as a prophet or not? Why must he restore the man's wife? Because he's a prophet. He took this man's wife, return her. That makes more sense, not because Abraham was a Navi, should Avimelech return Sarah. So I want to share with you a very interesting idea here that in some ways suggests that something was happening here that probably was not consistent with the way in which society, certainly in the ancient world, was constructed, but something is being asked of Avimelech to do that probably was very atypical and definitely out of the ordinary. Rabbi Yaakov Mecklenburg wrote a commentary to the Torah called Haktav v'Hakabbalah. And he maintains that when Hashem says to Avimelech, restore the man's wife, give back this man's wife, what did he mean to that? Give back the man's wife. And he says something interesting. It doesn't just mean take Sarah, take her out of your house, and give her back to Abraham. But rather, he says, look at the word used when the Torah is using the word return. It's hashev. Hashev. Well, hashavat aveda is the return of something that's lost. So the act of return might very well be best described by this verb of hashev. But Rabbi Mecklenburg suggests that that same word appears again in Tanakh. And in some situations, it has a slightly different connotation than simply return. And especially in Sefer Yeshayahu in chapter 30, it means more than return. It means pacification and even reconciliation. All right, so what does that mean? It means this, that when Hashem is telling Avimelech, the king, return Sarah, he's saying more than just make sure that she goes back to her husband. He's saying, and you, Avimelech, you have an obligation to reconcile. Well, with who? Well, I guess Abraham for sure, but more than with Abraham, you have an obligation to reconcile with Sarah. God here instructs Avimelech not merely to return Sarah, but to appease her and seek her forgiveness. Now that's different, because in the ancient world, I don't think many women were seen to sort of have their independent position that required acknowledgement, but they were probably seen simply as another possession of their husbands. or their masters. In this case, Hashem is turning to Abimelech and saying, that's not going to cut it here. Now, I'm creating a different world order in some ways, Hashem is saying. In the world order that I'm creating, men and women are married. And not only are they married, women are not considered to be property. And each one has a right to independent kavod and respect. And what you did, not only, of course, clearly, was an injury to Avram, but way more dramatically, it was to Sarah. And you need to make this good with Sarah specifically. So therefore, Rabbi Mecklenburg in his Haktava Kabbalah speaks of Abimelech's appeasement with Sarah. And therefore, if you think about that, in some ways, as I'm saying, this is really a jump way ahead in the future. That I don't know whether or not there's something a little bit foreshadowing about development of Jewish attitudes towards women in some ways, but it certainly was not a typical response to what was going on in the ancient world in Canaan and Gerar, where Abraham lived. So I want to end with one more Dvar Torah before our time runs out. In chapter 19, in the story of Stone, as you know, Lot gets saved. Lot gets saved. Why? Why did Hashem decide to save Lot? Vayihi, I'm reading now chapter 19, verse 29. Vayihi b'shachet Elokim et arei hakikar, vayizkor Elokim et Avraham, vayishalach et Lot mitoch ha'hapecha, v'hafoch et ha'arim asher yeshav behem Lot. I'll read this in English. And so it was when Hashem destroyed the cities of the plain that Hashem remembered Avraham. So he sent Lot from amidst the upheaval when he, Hashem, overturned the cities in which Lot had lived. So who is being remembered? Torah tells us that Avram is being remembered. So Avram is being remembered, and as a result of Hashem remembering Avraham, Lot gets saved. Now, why? What's the connection? Hashem remembers Avraham and Lot gets saved. So it's possible to suggest that, well, Avraham is Lot's uncle. Avraham's brother Haran died in the furnace in Ur Kasdim, and therefore Avram felt a sense of loyalty to his nephew, and he wanted to take care of him. So maybe that's what's being referred to. Hashem remembered that Avraham took care of Lot, so we saved Lot out of a kindness to Avraham, not to perhaps cause Avraham any unnecessary pain. But there is possibly another explanation afoot here. And Rashi suggests an interesting idea. Rashi suggests that Avraham owes something to Lot, not the other way around. Clearly, Lot owes something to Avram for taking care of him. But there's a very specific reason why Avraham owes Lot a debt of gratitude. What's that debt of gratitude? So when Avram and Sarah and Lot went down to Abimelech in Gerar, Lot knew who Sarah was. Lot knew that Sarah wasn't Abraham's relative. Lot knew that Sarah was Abraham's wife. And he could clearly have potentially told on them, but he protected his uncle and his aunt. And he didn't tell anybody anything. And while he may have known that Avraham was presenting the situation such that nothing bad would befall him and hopefully not Sarah, Lot didn't say anything. And so it's entirely possible, and the Midrash quotes this and Rashi does this, that's what's being referred to. That Hashem felt that Avraham's welfare was protected by Lot's silence, and Lot, as it were, deserves to be protected because of what he did on behalf of Avraham. So you could also say, well, didn't Lot have another sort of source of merit that might have also justified why Hashem was going to protect him. And you may remember the story of, well, when the angels came to storm, what did Lot do? He brought them into the house. So surely that's an act that's worthy of recognition. It's in the Torah. Obviously, the Torah wants to eternalize that story, that moment in which Lot helped these malachim who were there. So in and of itself, would that not have warranted some sort of gesture of saving and making sure he escapes? So Rabbi Dov Weinberger, who used to be the rabbi at the Young Israel in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, wrote his commentary to the Torah called Shem and Hatov. And Rabbi Weinberger suggests something interesting. He said, it's true that Lot welcomed guests, but when he welcomed his guests, he didn't do so out of an internal sense of care and concern for others, but it was a habit. It was a habit that he developed during the years he lived with Abraham. He had witnessed how many times Abraham brought people into his tent. But Abraham was motivated by feelings that Lot never had. So whatever Lot was doing at the time that he brought the angels into his home in Sdom, he wasn't doing it out of the same motivation that he saw his uncle do it. But rather he was doing it out of, I guess the word is conditioning. That's just what we do. We don't think about it, we do it. His silence with regard to Avram's identity in Egypt, by contrast, stemmed from a sincere sense of devotion and loyalty to Abraham. And that's why, perhaps, Rashi says, what he deserved was to be rewarded for that and not for what he did to the angels in Sdom. What he did for the angels in Sdom could have simply been perfunctory. It could have been gestures, but not really from his heart. But to withhold the truth, withhold what you know in a situation where there is an element of danger in the presence of the king, that must have come from a different place. It does, however, this last idea make you wonder a little bit about if Lot's helping the strangers in Sdom was not worthy of its own reward because it was perfunctory. Is that a message about the sort of desirability of doing the right thing simply because you don't think about it? It's just automatic, and we go through a lot of different motions in life. Maybe there's some sort of message here that we're glad that Lot found the merit of saving his uncle and his aunt, but there is I think, criticism that's being leveled at him by this idea that what he did in the city of Sdom to help the Malachim was a good thing. But it wasn't a good thing that emerged from any sort of conscious and deliberate decision. It was just something he did automatically. Is the commitment to our parents and our ancestors simply because that's what they did, is that enough? Is that a laudable quality? Should it earn us merit? Even if it's not accompanied by conviction? And should we distinguish between acts performed strictly by habit or say, no, as long as you do the right thing, it is irrelevant what motivated you to do it? I'm not sure I'm going to give an answer to that. I'm not sure there is an answer, but let's leave it with that. And let's hope that we do have the conviction to do the right thing, not just because it's the thing to do, but because it's the thing we want to do. So thank you, everybody, for joining me this evening. Please feel free to unmute yourselves, and happy to chat with you and listen to some of your thoughts and feedback. Maybe you even have some questions.
I have a question.
Okay, I'm not sure who's asking.
Yeah, me.
Me? Oh, hi, me.
The Red Sox fan. So I have a question about Lot. Didn't he offer to send his daughters out?
He did. Correct. So that you would say like cancels everything out.
That's for me. Cancels
100%.
Yeah, I said to Marty, well, yeah, of course he invited them in, and then he offered them his daughters.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello.
So the question, I guess, is there this notion of sort of if you do a good thing and do a bad thing, is the good thing canceled out? Is a good thing cancel out, or is there some sort of list that's written that it's not even on the charts? Once you do the bad thing, which is really bad, the good thing that you did is washed away. It's as though it never happened. So Joyce has an interesting question. And clearly, I think from all of us who read the story, I think this was such a despicable action on the father's part,
Yeah.
So, but it's I think it's an interesting question to say. So, do those despicable actions eradicate and wash away any good that could have also been done by the same person? Maybe if it's at the same episode, it does. Maybe it's not. I'm not sure, but I think it's definitely worth raising and thinking about. I think I heard somebody else want to ask something, but I don't know who it was.
Rabbi, I have a question. When we're talking about tzedakah and mishpat, I think I have a question, but I'm not sure. And the reason why I'm not sure is I'm thinking of a phrase in davening that I don't know. I don't remember the exact wording, and it's in the morning davening in the Halakha that comes right after Ashrei, and it said Shukim Mishpat. What's the word there?
I'm just putting my Siddur just so we can take a look at it.
But
After Ashrei?
yeah.
Oseh Mishpat La'ashukim Noten Lechem
Okay.
La're'esim Hashem. Is that the one you're doing? He secures I'm reading from the Koran, Marty. He secures justice for the oppressed. He gives food to the hungry.
One oppressed, is that a good word translation for Shukim? Because I've always wondered if the word should be tzedakah instead of mishpat, because mishpat implies that he's judging them, or not the way you read it, but the way I always read it.
Well, I think in this, if I'm understanding this Pasuk in Tehillim correctly, as David HaMelech intends it, Hashem is Osem Mishpat La'ashukim. It's easy to oppress people who are vulnerable for whatever reason of the source of their vulnerability. So while there may not be people to advocate for them because they're so vulnerable, Hashem will, as it were, demand justice for them. Osem Mishpat, he will in fact not demand justice, he will secure justice. He will make it happen. Whereas sometimes there are people in our communities who are taken advantage of, but Hashem will not allow that to flourish. That's the way I understand this.
Okay. Well, I always understood that he was judging the Shukim, which was, now I finally understand it. Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Back to the question about him offering his daughters, maybe because he didn't actually send them out. That saved him. He didn't actually send his daughters out.
He just made the offer.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know.
I think Joyce's comment is even the idea of making the offer is repulsive.
Oh, it's totally abhorrent and
He's
disgusting.
the father. He's the father. Would he even suggest such a thing?
Right.
And he made a point of saying my virgin daughters.
Yeah. Well, I think in response to what you just said, Joyce, and also you, Sharon, is I think what we're witnessing is what happens when a person disassociates himself from a source of holiness. Had Lot decided to remain in the presence of Abraham and conduct himself in a manner that allowed for them to stay together, likely he would never have come to this. But he allowed himself, he chose to separate, and he chose to allow himself to sort of go to a place where these influences changed him, or at least changed part of him. So unfortunately, people who go to repulsive places sometimes do repulsive things.
I would think he would even put himself at risk and trust in God to save him, as opposed to substituting that trust and faith by sending out his daughters.
You know, it's an interesting thing you raise, because one of the things that I've always wondered about is, Abraham's own personal background, I think, in my opinion, informs part of his life. Because according to our oral tradition, Rashi mentioned this at the end of last week's Parshat, the Torah tells us that Avram had a brother called Haran, and Haran died, meit al pnei terach aviv. So it's an unusual way of saying that. So Rashi tells us what that actually meant. That Haran died not just in the presence of his father, which is true, but he died because of his father. So Rashi tells us about what we probably remember as a childhood story in our preschool years of Abraham smashing the idols in his father's store.
Right.
But that was part of Abraham's discovery process of a real God. So yes, he did. He really fought back, both metaphorically, intellectually, as well as physically, against the proliferation of idols. And it was his own father, Avram's own dad, which turned him into the cops. Avram's father, Terach, turned him into the king Nimrod. And as a result of that, Nimrod tries to execute Avram by throwing him in the fiery furnace. So that's an extraordinary moment. Imagine the trauma of your father trying to have you killed, where fathers should be protecting their children. But according to the ancient world, this was not the way in which the world conducted itself. Abraham and Judaism brought to the forefront this notion of these things are totally, completely unacceptable. Child sacrifice can't happen. Now, of course, that creates the theological and philosophic problem of this parsha with Akedat Yitzchak.
Yeah.
Maybe that's one of the lessons that seems to be emerging. I don't know if it's a primary lesson, but that's not how we conduct. Hashem stopped it from happening. But be that as it may, Joyce, it's possible to, I think we need to wrap our heads around the fact that ancient society did not necessarily have the same sensitivities as we do. Even, I don't even know, Joyce, if you have to go as far as ancient society. The Industrial Revolution in Europe and beyond. I mean, what's child labor? What parent would have a 9-year-old kid working 12 hours in a dark room like that? How could that even be? But there were standards, social standards that were so different then than they are now. That's talking about the Industrial Revolution, and certainly in the ancient world.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. I always enjoy myself, and I hope you do. This is a highlight for my week, and I just want to say thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Me too.
And
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing everybody next Tuesday night. I do want to just declare, and I don't want anybody to feel bad. So I believe that next Tuesday night at this time or sometime during the time that we usually learn together, there is going to be a Yurt site program in memory of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha.
Right, yeah.
And should anybody wish to participate, please feel free to do so. I'm quite content to keep the shiur going in memory and honor of his holy work, and to dedicate our learning to Zecher Nishmat Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. So either way, I don't think there's a lose here at all. You can please feel comfortable joining the program. And should you wish to join our learning, we will dedicate the learning to the memory of Rabbi Sachs. Zichron Olam.
So but these are recorded, right? Can we
Oh,
access?
yeah, I'm going to record like I did tonight. And
So
they're
we can
now
access
posted,
it?
they're posted on the shul's website, Joyce.
Fine, okay.
And,
So
and I
you-
also suspect the program for Rabbi Sachs will probably be recorded as well.
I would
Is
imagine. Yeah.
that a Toronto program?
Is it a Toronto program, Marty asked?
Or
That's
the
Great
world?
question. I didn't think so.
I don't-
Didn't think so, but I don't have the details in front of me, Marty, so I can't really.
I think it's something that the Sachs Legacy is
Yeah,
doing.
I think
and-
so too. So I'm
Yeah,
sure you're
so
going
it's
to be
all
seeing
over.
information. I'm sure you're going to
Yeah.
be seeing information about it during the upcoming week.
Thank you, Rabbi. I
Very
always
welcome,
enjoy
everybody.
this.
Have a
Very
great
much,
week.
Rabbi.
Thank
Have a
you.
great
Rabbi.
week. Stay well.
Thank you.
Laila Tov.
Thank
Laila
you.
Tov, everyone.
Laila Tov, right?